In my last lecture on painting, I talked about 4 famous post-impressionists. Today, I'm going to more or less finish up the 19th century with the collection of painting movements that are sometimes lumped together as fin de siècle, which is just French for end of the century, although it conveys a broader meaning of a time of rapid change, disillusionment, increased focus on the inner life, on sexuality. Anyway, you'll see all of that soon. Now, symbolism was actually a more important movement in literature and music than it was in art. Poets such as Baudelaire, composers such as Debussy and Wagner thought that art should spring from the emotions, from the artist's inner spirit. And the best guide to that inner spirit came in dreams or in visions. Not accidentally, this was also the period when Sigmund Freud began to explore the ways that dreams reveal our hidden fears and desires. The symbolists didn't know his work, although by the time we get to Klimt, the Viennese certainly do. But their art reflected similar obsessions. Maybe there was something in the water. So, any guess as to who the temptress in this painting might be? She's Salome, confronting the ghost of John the Baptist, or at least his head. This theme of sexually alluring and dangerous women, what would sometimes be called the femme fatale, the fatal or deadly woman, shows up frequently in late 19th and early 20th century art, especially after Freud puts in his 2 cents worth. So stay tuned for Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, and for that matter, Gustav Klimt, with whom we're going to end this lecture. So this rather overwrought painting by the same artist again portrays an apparition. This time it's Jupiter appearing to a mortal girl. Moreau loved Wagner, and the fantasy, the brilliant color, the exotic busyness of this painting all rather remind me of a Wagner opera, although the fat lady does not appear ready to sing. De Chavannes, too, sought refuge in the imaginary, but in this case, his imaginary world was classical mythology, but highly idealized and kind of, well, actually later on we'll use the term surreal to describe dreamlike, but it was tempting to use it here a little ahead of our time. We see this dreamlike, exotic, notably unrealistic subject. Notice that here the colors are much paler, almost as if the scene is being viewed through a dreamlike screen. And, well, nightmares are dreams, too. One art critic called Redon the prince of mysterious dreams. And this is an interesting quote from him. Remember that you're going to have a quote on the exam that you're going to need to comment on. I actually think those are among the easier questions. But notice, my originality consists in bringing to life in a human way improbable beings and making them live according to the laws of probability. So putting logic at the service of the invisible. Redon was drawn also to fantasy, but in this case, a more macabre fantasy, and again, the unseen world of the psyche. And if you notice that sex is a pervasive theme in these paintings, well, welcome to Unit 12 and the modern age. Really, this entire unit should probably get an R rating. The dream theme continues in this work by Henri Rousseau, who is a self-taught primitive or naive painter. That's a term that's often used for painters who've not had formal training and whose paintings in some ways, superficially at least, resemble those of children. He was much admired by the self-identified avant-garde. That avant-garde refers to, it's a military term referring to the scouts who go in ahead of the troops, kind of pave the way. Artists embrace the term to show that they were paving the way for the future, that they were ahead of their time. But avant-garde, post-impressionist, and expressionist artists, especially Picasso, really admired Rousseau. Rousseau himself worked alone without association with other artists, but Picasso gave a very famous dinner party for Rousseau, who was really baffled to have all these artists gathering to honor him, since he lived very much outside their world. But Rousseau's paintings are very recognizable for their fantasy world, their kind of childlike fantasy world. These will show up a lot in paintings in children's rooms. They have sharp lines, although they're really not children's subjects. Painstaking details, magical subject matter. Very often they include lions or other animals. The term primitivism, by the way, was also sometimes applied to Paul Gauguin, especially his Tahiti paintings. I'm going to talk more about the impact of primitive art on early 20th century painting when I get to Expressionism and Cubism. That's the next lecture. I'm just going to show you a few more Henri Rousseau paintings, mostly just because I like them. Suspect you will too. And again, he is so recognizable that I could imagine him being an artist that the College Board asks you to identify without attribution. Really hard to miss. Well, since we're talking about dreams and nightmares, you're probably expecting to learn more about this famous painting, and you will, but I'm actually saving it for my next lecture. Even though it showed up in this chapter, I think it fits more naturally with Expressionism, so I promise we'll be back. Instead, I'm going to end with Gustav Klimt, an Austrian painter who has come to define the fin de siecle movement. Klimt was a member of the Austrian secessionist movement. It took that name because these painters very self-consciously seceded from Austria's conservative art establishment. Austria was a very conservative society dominated by the church, by the emperor, and in fact, Vienna was the center of an empire. But underneath this staid respectability was a really seething intellectual life. At this point in history, Vienna really is the center of artistic, of musical, intellectual movements, really a place of great cultural ferment. And this is the place where Sigmund Freud was beginning to publish his extraordinarily influential works on the subconscious. By the way, Wittgenstein was also publishing his extremely influential works on language, which I probably won't get into, although they're very interesting. At any rate, Freud talked about how our subconscious is revealed in dreams and how the sexual impulse underlies most human actions and feelings. And so there's always been a lot of sex in art, but it's really going to come to the fore at this point and on. So let's watch an introduction to this work. Well, do you remember these works from earlier in the course? Who is this dangerous-looking lady? Well, it's our old bloodthirsty pal Judith, reincarnated now as a sexy femme fatale who lures men to their doom. Our final video clip is going to clinch my R rating for this lecture with a discussion of how Klimt and his successors honed in on the erotic and the dangerous. You're just going to see a section of this. It's a very interesting video on this theme and goes on to talk about this influence in later works. I may even use some of it later on, but as always, feel free to watch the whole thing.